Geez, I apologize for that. So just to continue, right? So we are on the A plus students.ca and we are doing grade 2 adjectives. So once again, apologies for the network issue. I'm not sure why the screen did not show the did not share. So I just quickly went out and back in. But thank you very much for your patience. All right, so we're going to adjectives, right? And we say that the first lesson that we're going to be focusing on is use sense words. So if we use sense words, right, then it says that firstly, an adjective, it is a word that tells us about the person, animal, place, or thing. So an adjective, it tells us about a person, an animal, or place, or thing, right? So we basically can say that it describes a person, an animal, a place, or a thing, right? And some adjectives, they either tell how a noun looks, how the noun sounds, how the noun tastes, how the noun smells, or how the noun feels, right? So that is basically what an adjective is. That is why we say an adjective, it actually describes the noun, right? It can either describe the noun in how it looks, how it sounds, how it tastes, how it smells, or how it feels, right? And if we look at the first, or let's say, if we look at the few sentences that we're going to be focusing on, it says, the sun looks bright. The sun looks bright, which means that we are now describing, or it is basically telling us about how the sun looks, right? So the sun, it looks bright. So bright is the adjective that tells us about the sun, right? And it tells us how the sun looks, right? Which means that we can say that bright describes the sun. Then we have the drums sound loud. The drums sound loud, right? Which means that if we were to mention if there's something that tells us about the drums, then we can say that loud, or how loud the drums sound, right? The sound, or let's say the loudness of the sound, if that is the word, it tells us or describes the drums. So the sound of the drums. These cookies, right? So cookies, it tastes sweet, right? So which means that you are having sweet cookies, right? So sweet is the word that tells us about how the cookies taste, right? So they are sweet, or you can say they are tasty, but you can basically use words there to either describe or that tells us about the cookies. The air smells fresh, right? So the air, right? So fresh tells us how the air smells, right? So the air smells fresh. So we can also say that the freshness of the air, it describes the air, right? So how fresh the air is, it describes the air, specifically in scent. And my hair feels soft, right? So soft is the adjective that tells us about the hair. So even if the person said my hair is long, then long could be the adjective that describes or tells us about the person's hair, right? And we can also like words or adjectives can also tell us maybe how the noun is in color, right? So we can also use color like blue, black, dirty, clean, you know, smelling or how it smells. We mentioned fresh or not fresh, right? So basically, an adjective, it is a word that tells us about the person, an animal, a place, or a thing, right? And we can also say that an adjective, it describes the person, it describes the animal, describes the place, or it describes the thing, right? And we see that adjectives can also tell us how the noun looks, how the noun sounds, how the noun tastes, smells, or feels, right? And sometimes an adjective, like in the sentences that we see over here, the adjective does not have to necessarily be the word in front of the noun, right? So we don't have to say beautiful dress, black dress, loud drums, sweet cookies, right? We can also, the word, or let's say the adjective, can be after the noun, right? But we just need to be able to identify the specific word or adjective that tells us about the noun. All right, so that is an adjective. So if we look at our sentence, right, which is Logan wanted Logan wanted to ride on the horse. So Logan wanted to ride on the horse, right? So we need to choose the correct or base adjective to complete the sentence. So Logan wanted to ride on the horse. So we need to choose a word that best describes the horse, right? So yeah, they're giving us a few options, right? Well, not options, but like answers. They say the best answer is spotted, right? So the spotted horse, right? The spotted horse. And spotted is an adjective, right? So spotted is an adjective and it tells us how the horse looked. So you can even say that Logan wanted to ride the big horse, the small horse. We can say Logan wanted to ride the black horse, the brown horse. In this case, it is the spotted horse, which tells us how the horse looks. All right. The next one. Robin made a pair of gloves for her grandmother. So the possible or best answer or adjective that we can choose is Robin made a pretty. So they say we need to use pretty. So Robin made a pretty pair of gloves for her grandmother, right? So pretty is the adjective, right? That tells us about the gloves that she made for her grandmother, and it tells us how the gloves looks, or the so basically we can say that the gloves, well, let's say how the gloves looks, it is pretty gloves, right? Yeah, they're telling us we need to use the word smelly, right? Yes, smelly is also an adjective, right? But we cannot use smelly within that sentence because smelly refers to a more negative type of adjective, right? And in this case, I don't think anybody would want to make smelly gloves, right? So she made pretty gloves, right? So not smelly gloves. So as much as smelly is also an adjective, but it does not fit the correct sentence. A line of what ants walked across the picnic blanket. So if we were to choose the correct adjective to describe the ants, right, then we can say a line of tiny ants because ants are so tiny. Or you can say a line of black ants, right? But in this case, we're going to use a line of tiny ants, right? And it basically just gives us an indication of how small or how tiny the ants are. So tiny ants. All right, let's go to next. My cup of soup looks too. So my cup of soup looks too. The best possible answer that is given, right, is full. right? So my cup of soup looks too full. So this person has a full cup of soup, especially during winter when it is cold and he's sitting in front of the fireplace, for example. So my cup of soup looks full. So full is an adjective and that tells us how the cup looks, right? So the cup is filled. So we can basically see that that is how the cup looks. It is a full cup of soup. Here they said silent, all right? And silent, yes, is an adjective, but silent is, it just does not make sense within the sentence that we have chosen. So my cup of soup looks too silent? No. So silent is an adjective, but it does not match that sentence. We can both fit in that wide chair, right? So if we use the word wide chair, right? So wide chair, long chair. So we're going to say wide chair, right? Which means that the chair is wide enough for both of us to fit, right? So wide, we can both fit in that wide chair. So wide in the sentence is an adjective and it tells us how the chair looks, right? It is a wide chair for both of us to fit in. And they gave us another answer, which is tired, but tired is, it does not make sense within the sentence, right? So tired, yes, is an adjective, but it does not fit within our sentence. So the word, the best possible word or adjective is going to be wide. So we can both fit in that wide chair. Our dog Ace walked all over the kitchen floor with his, we can either say dirty paws. In this case, they mention muddy paws, right? Or we can say dirty paws, right? So our dog Ace walked all over the kitchen floor with his muddy paws. Or like I say, we can either say dirty paws, right? So he is basically dirtying the floors, right? So the word muddy, it is the adjective and it tells us how the paws looks, right? The paws are muddy, or we can even use the word dirty, right? All right, so basically an adjective, once again, it tells us about a person, an animal, a place, or a thing. And some of the adjectives, they tell how a noun looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels, right? And remember, our adjective does not necessarily have to be directly in front of the noun. It can be after the noun, can be before the noun, right? As long as you are able to identify the noun as well as the word that tells us about the noun, right? So the word that tells us about the noun is the adjective. All right, so now we can go to our test. The disc looks too. Is it too tasty to fit in the corner? Or the disc looks too large to fit in the corner? So tasty or large. We need to choose the correct word between those two words. Tasty or large. So the disc looks too tasty or too large to fit in the corner. All right, so if we choose the best adjective, right, then we can say that the disc looks too large, meaning it is too big to fit in the corner, right? So another word for large is big, right? So if something is too large or too big, then it means that it will be a bit impossible to fit in either in the space or in this case in the corner. So large. Is it the silver road or the bumpy road made the car bounce up and down? We need to choose between silver or bumpy. So the silver or bumpy road made the car bounce up and down. We need to select the best adjective to complete the sentence. Silver or bumpy. Something that makes the road or the car, bounce up and down. All right. So silver basically just tells us about the color, right? And in this case, it is nothing to do with color, right? So we will choose the word bumpy because the bumpy road, it made the car to bounce up and down because the road is bumpy or uneven. My cup of soup looks too. Is it too full or too silent? Too full or too silent? So if we choose the best adjective, then we can say full, right? Because silent, yes, it is an adjective, but it just does not make sense within that sentence. So my cup of soup looks too full. So we're going to choose the correct word, which is full. All right, so that is use since words. Now we're going on to does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? All right, so we said that an adjective, it tells us about the person, place, animal, or thing, which basically means that the adjective tells us about the noun, right? It tells us about the noun, and it can either tell us how the noun smells, how the noun tastes, how the noun looks, right? So that is adjectives. But now an adjective, right, can also tell us what kind, or an adjective can tell us how many. And we said an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun, which is a person, a place, an animal, or a thing. And now we are going to find out some of the adjectives, right, that either answers the questions what kind, or some of the adjectives that answers the questions how many. So we can have adjective that tells us what kind or how many, right? And how many can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be two, three, right? Which is a number, right? How many can even be few, some, many, and so on. All right. So if we look at adjectives that tells us or that answers the questions what kind, right? Then we look at, for example, the small baby smiled, right? So it's like you asking yourself, what kind of baby, right? So the small baby, it tells us what kind of baby. So the small baby smiled. So small is the adjective that tells us about the noun, which is baby. It's a small baby. She carried heavy books. So what kind of books? So she carried heavy books, right? So you could have also said she carried many books, but that will be under how many. Then some of the adjectives that answer the questions, which is how many, right? So how many, like I said, it can either be a number, 1, 2, 5, 10, or so on, or you don't necessarily have to give a specific number. You can use words like some, many, few, and so on. So, adjective that answer the question how many. One baby smiled. So it's like asking yourself, how many babies smiled? And then one is our correct answer because only one baby smiled. She carried some books. So how many books did she carry? Some books, right? So some is the adjective that tells us how many books she carried. So once again, an adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, and some adjectives they answer the questions what kind or how many. All right, so now if we look at our sentence, it says look at the adjective in bold, right? Does it tell you what kind or does it tell you how many? She is a nice cat, right? So nice. So the nice does it tell us what kind or how many? So nice basically tells us what kind of cat. So if you ask yourself, what kind of cat is that? We can say it is a nice cat, right? So a nice cat. So in this case, it tells us what kind of cat it is. It does not tell us how many. Several children laughed. Several children laughed. We need to identify if it's telling us what kind or how many. And in this case, it says several children laughed, right? So it's like asking yourself, how many children laughed? So, how many children laughed? So, we can then say several children laughed. So, several is the amount that tells us how many children laughed. Mom will light 5 candles. Mom will light 5 candles, right? So, five, it tells us how many candles mom will light. So it tells us how many. Because it would tell us how many candles will mom light. So she will light 5 candles. All right. So just to recap, an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun. And some of the adjectives, right, they answer questions like what kind, or some adjectives that answer the questions how many. So it's like asking yourself, like, what kind of boat is it? Right? So we can either say it's a sailboat, a red boat, a white boat, big boat, small boat, right? Tells us what kind. And then how many can either be in the form of a number, or in this case, it can be either several, 5, some, many, and so on. All right, so now we're going to our test, right? On does the adjective tells you what kind or does it tell you how many? We're going to choose either between what kind or how many. So we need to specifically look at the adjective in bold, and then we need to say if it asks us the question what kind or how many. He has brown skates. Brown skates, right? So brown, the color brown, oopsie, the color brown, it tells us what kind of skates. It does not tell us how many skates. We saw wild animals, right? So wild animals, right? It does not tell us how many animals. They're not saying we saw several of animals or many animals. They're saying we saw wild animals, which means that we need to ask ourselves what kind of animals, right? So it's wild animals. Ruth has a big secret, right? So big secret. So the word big, right? It's like asking what kind of secrets, right? So he's keeping or has a big secret. And then Cole has blue eyes. Cole has blue eyes, right? So in this case, we can ask ourselves what kind of eyes does Cole have because it does not tell us about how many. Oopsie. So we can say what kind. All right, and if you have that, then well done. All right, let's go to this one more before we go. Lindsay will send 7 letters, right? So the word seven, seven already tells us how many letters Lindsay is going to send. So how many? All right. So now we're going back, right? So that was adjectives that tells us what kind, or adjectives that tells us how many. So now we're going to identify the adjective that describes the noun. So we're going to adjective that, and remember we said an adjective, right? It is a word that tells you about a noun, right? And some of the adjectives they either answers the question what kind, or they answer the question how many. All right, so now we need to select the adjective that tells us how many, right? That tells us how many. All birds have wings, right? So now we need to find the adjective that tells us how many, right? So all birds have wings, right? So if we select the adjective that tells us how many, and then we can say all is our adjective, right? And all, it tells us about the noun, which is birds. So all birds, they have wings. So they tell us how many birds have wings. So they don't say 5 birds, 10 birds, they're saying all birds have wings, and that tells us how many birds. The old cat sits on the bed. So the old cat sits on the bed. We need to select the adjective that tells us what kind. The old cat sits on the bed. All right, so if we ask ourselves what kind of cat sits on the bed, then we can say, oopsie, then we can say old. So old is the adjective that tells us about the cat, or about the noun cat, and it tells us what kind of cat it is. It is an old cat, right? So old is the word that tells us about the noun, which is cat. Mr. Wells is a friendly neighbor. So Mr. Wells is a friendly neighbor. We need to select the adjective that tells you what kind, right? And if we look at the adjective that tells us what kind, then we can say friendly is the word. See? So friendly is the word that tells us what kind of neighbor Mr. Wells is, right? Because Mr. Wells is a friendly neighbor. So it's like asking what kind of neighbor is Mr. Wells? Then we can say he is a friendly neighbor. So friendly is the adjective that tells us about the noun neighbor, right? And it tells us what kind of neighbor Mr. Wells is. All right, so we're going to our test, right? Because these are now words where we identify the adjective that describes the noun. I had a hot drink. We need to select the adjective that tells us what kind. I had a hot drink. So it's like asking what kind of drink did you have, right? And then we will say I had a hot drink, right? So hot drink being it can, oh sorry, it can be coffee, tea, hot chocolate, Milo, or so on, right? So a hot drink. I will write two letters. We need to select the adjective that tells us how many. So I will write two letters. So it's like asking yourself, like, how many letters are you going to write? Two letters. So two tells us how many. This is a giant whale. This is a giant whale. We need to find the adjective that tells us what kind of whale is this. So we can say it is a giant whale. So giant is the adjective that tells us about the noun whale. So giant. All right. So that is basically us identify adjective that describes the noun and specifically by telling us either what kind or how many, right? So lastly, we're going to identify adjectives, right? So we're going to identify adjectives and we see that an adjective, it is a word that tells you about a noun, and some adjectives that answer the questions of what kind or how many, right? Some adjectives, they answer the questions what kind or how many. All right, so we're going to the first one that is Dale drinks the warm milk. So Dale drinks the warm milk. Remember, when selecting an adjective, right, we do not select any articles such as a, an, or the. So we're not going to use or select a, an, or the because those are articles. It is not adjectives, right? So Dale drinks warm milk. So it's like us asking, what kind of milk does Dave drink? So we can then say Dave drinks warm milk. So warm is the adjective and it tells us about the milk. What kind of milk? Mom drives an old car. Mom drives an old car. So what kind of car does mom drive? She drives an old car. So old is the adjective that tells us about the type of car that she drives. So old. All right. So old is the adjective that tells us what kind of car she drives. Give the baby some toys. So give the baby some toys. We need to select the adjective, right? That either tells us what kind or that tells us how many. So in this case, give the baby some toys, right? Just like asking, how many do you want, right? And you respond by saying some toys, not too much, not too little, for example. So some toys. So some is the adjective that tells us about the toys, right? And it answers the question, how many toys should the baby have? So give the baby some toys. So only some. So some is the adjective within that sentence. All right, let's go to our test. We need to select the adjective, right? And remember, when we select an adjective, we do not select the articles, which is a, an, or the, right? Don't select those ones. So stop at the red light. We need to choose the correct adjective that tells us about the light. So if it tells us about the light, then we can say it is red, right? So the adjective that describes the type of light, It is red. So the red light, not the green light, not the orange light, the red light. Give the baby some toys, right? So some, and it tells us how many toys we need to give to the baby. Nina likes sunny days. So Nina likes sunny days. So we need to select the adjective within that sentence. Nina likes sunny days. Right? So if Nina likes sunny days, then sunny is the adjective, right? That tells us about what kind of days. It is sunny days. So sunny is correct. Maria knows 7 jokes. So how many jokes does Maria know? 7 jokes, right? So 7 is the number that tells us how many jokes she knows. All right, so we basically went over all of our lessons where we use sense words. Does the adjective tell us what kind or how many, right? And we see that with what kind, it can either give us what kind in form of color, shape, taste, like, and so on, right? And how many will be a specific number, right? Either two, three, five, several, some, many, and so on. So those are words or adjective that tells us how many, right? And then we also identified the adjective that describes a noun as well as identifying adjectives. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to read. So you're going to a+classes.ca. Once you are on the class assignments a+students.ca, you're going to learning materials. And you're going to scroll, oopsie, no, let's first go to reading. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to these 4 beautiful purple boxes. And we're going to read the thin one that says read along audio books level 1, right? So these are audio books, meaning that they read it for us. All right, so a book. So this is a book called Black and White. All right, so that is basically the end of the book, which is black and white. And in the book, what they did was they basically described or told us what kind of different animals that they mentioned. So the adjectives that they used was black and white to describe the animals in color, right? All right, so that is basically the end of our lesson now on adjectives. And we see an adjective, it tells us about the noun. It either tells us what kind or it tells us how many. Adjectives can also tell us about smell, how it looks, how it tastes, right? Size of it, right? And also, like we said, with how many, it doesn't have to be one, two, three, four, five, for example. It can be several, two, um, many, and so on, right? So that is adjectives. So thank you very much for joining the lesson, and I really hope you're going to have an amazing evening. And just before I end, I just want to apologize again for how our session started with the technical issue that we had, right? So later on it was resolved. So I hope that the streaming was way better. So once again, apologies for that, but you should have an amazing evening further. Good night.